Like to welcome everyone today to a book talk by Juliane Hammer, Muslim Community Efforts Against Domestic Violence. Professor Hammer is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, right down the road. She specializes in the study of Sufism, gender and sexuality in Muslim societies and communities, race and gender in U.S. Muslim communities, as well as contemporary Muslim thought, activism, and practice. She is author of several books, including Peaceful Families, most recently, Peaceful Families, American Muslim Efforts Against Domestic Violence, American Muslim Women, Religious Authority, and Activism, and Palestinians Born in Exile. She's also edited the seminal work, A Jihad for Justice, about the life and work of Amina Wadud, and has also co-edited the Cambridge Companion to American Islam with Omid Safi, as well as Muslim Women and Gender Justice, Concepts, Sources, and Histories. The moderator today will be Dr. Sajida Jalalzai, who is an assistant professor of religion at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas.
তাদের ইন্টারভিউ জিনিসটা মাত্র শুরু করছে তাদের ইন্টারভিউ প্রসেস মাত্র শুরু করছে
She specializes in the study of North American Islam and earned her PhD from Columbia University in American religions. She is currently writing a book on Muslim leadership education in three Protestant Christian seminaries in the United States and Canada. She examines these programs' contribution to the creation of new professional fields, such as Muslim chaplaincy, and she analyzes the interfaith logics that they promote, as well as the ways in which the secular state shapes understandings of good religion. Welcome, Professors Jalalzai and Hammer.
Should I go? Okay, so rather than a sort of traditional book talk, which we thought would be a little bit more difficult to follow on Zoom, and at this point in the pandemic, I think we're all more or less zoomed out, especially when one person is talking. My students definitely are. We decided on a little bit of a different format. So I'm gonna spend about 10 minutes telling you a little bit about the book, assuming that not everyone who is in attendance has read it. So you have sort of a basis for the conversation. And then Dr. Jalalzai and I are going to engage in a conversation about the book as colleagues, as scholars. And then there will also be a time period where we both are interested in engaging with the audience. And that can, at least on my part, I'd be interested in both something along the lines of Q&A, but I'm also interested in actual conversation, which is a little bit of a different thing to me. I want to also start by thanking Dr. McBarney and Julie Maxwell for putting this together, for inviting me to this conversation. We were just talking about the fact that this is our third attempt at this conversation. The book came out in August of 2019, and last year in the spring, we made 2 attempts, both unsuccessful, and so third time's a charm. So hopefully today will be, a successful event. So I want to start with showing you the book, not to advertise it. I feel a little bit uncomfortable with the advertising part. But one reason why I wanted to show it to you, and I don't think you need to see my face, is if you look very, very closely at your screen, you see that the cover image is not only a tile, but a tile that's broken, that has been mended. And this is a tile I own. I bought it many, many years ago in Istanbul, and then someone dropped it. And I loved it so much that I glued it back together, and it became, over the course of the 10 years that I worked on this book project, a sort of representation, a visual representation of questions that I have that are both academic questions and perhaps secular questions, but also deeply religious questions about the nature of trauma, about the possibility of experiencing trauma, including that of domestic violence, and still being or being again a full person with a full human life experience. And so I was very appreciative when Princeton University Press was willing to entertain the idea of making that the cover of the book. And now the book and the tiles will sit on my shelf here to my left as a reminder of this sort of lofty goal in some ways. So the book continued research that I've done over the course of the almost 20 years that I've been in the US on Muslim activism for social justice broadly, and more specifically with a focus on gender justice. And as I said, it's been 10 years, it was 10 years in the making. My interest in issues and discourses in particular around domestic violence, which comes out of earlier work on Muslim feminist Quran interpretation and Muslim activism around women-led prayer and women's leadership, was jolted into action in early 2009 with the really terrible, particularly terrible murder of Asia Zubair. And the reason was both the sort of trauma of being a witness to the media representations of that, but also the fact that in the wake and in response to the murder of Asia Zubair, Muslim community organizations stepped up conversations about domestic violence, and it became clear, at least to me for the first time, that there are dedicated organizations that work on domestic violence in Muslim communities. I will freely admit that I was not aware of that before, which is perhaps also one of the sort of purposes of the book, is to highlight and to showcase that that work exists in the first place, because invisibility and silence are part of the trauma of not addressing domestic violence in communities. The book is based on both ethnographic and textual materials. One really important thing I do want to see is that it's not a book about the existence of domestic violence in Muslim communities. There are others in fields other than religious studies and Islamic studies that are far better equipped to do that work, and some of them have done that work in social work, in criminal justice work. And so my interest was in people and organizations that work against domestic violence in Muslim communities. So it's a different angle on the issue in some ways. And I was particularly interested in organizations and advocates that frame their own work against domestic violence explicitly as Muslims and in religious terms. So it's a cross-section of people. I didn't include everyone. There are people who sort of fall on the margins of that definition. And there is some overlap between explicitly Muslim organizations working against domestic violence and those that are sort of called in the literature the mainstream. That can mean secular American organizations. It can also mean other religious organizations, but not Muslim ones. And there is also part of the landscape is also our organizations that are defined around the particular needs of certain ethnic and racial communities. And so Muslims sort of overlap with some of those in particular ways. I identified 3 areas of these particular Muslim efforts against domestic violence. One is to raise awareness of domestic violence, its existence, but also its dynamics and its appearances in Muslim communities. The second one is the purpose of providing direct services to victims and survivors. And the third one broadly is what I sort of think of as educating the mainstream. So that includes raising awareness of the particular needs that Muslim families, Muslim victims and survivors, and Muslim communities might have in contexts like law enforcement, legal services, and also mainstream anti-domestic violence organizations. And while things with 3 bullet points are always really appealing, nothing is that neat in real life. And so some of the advocates and some of the organizations and some of the networks do overlapping parts of these 3 types of efforts. And I will also say that one of the things that makes the book basically a historical work is that this landscape of Muslim efforts against domestic violence that I captured between 2000, like the end of 2009 and 2018 is a snapshot that's basically frozen in time, in the sense that one of the defining features of the Muslim anti-DV landscape is that it's constantly changing, and mostly not for good reasons. So that's also maybe something to talk further about, right? So like some of the organizations that I write extensively about in the book don't exist anymore, or have completely changed leadership. Some of the many advocates that I interviewed over the course of 6 or 7 years are no longer doing anti-DV work for various kinds of reasons. So I'm thinking of some of the sort of arguments that I'm trying to make in the book. And I'm reminded, I'm an advisor to graduate students, I'm reminded that I always tell my graduate students that they can only make one argument in their dissertation. And here I am having a list of 3 or 4 or 5 things that I was trying to juggle in the book, because I couldn't decide on only doing one of them. So it's not very consistent in advisor terms. And some of those are very intentional as themes that run throughout the book. And at least one of them wasn't something that I saw as my intention, but that happened anyways. So the first sort of main point of intervention that I think I'm making is the introduction of the notion of an ethic of non-abuse as a baseline that holds together everyone that I encountered. So rejecting domestic violence as a possibility is sort of the baseline. And I think it's an ethical commitment that for me has raised really important questions about the ways in which we as scholars in particular talk about the relationship between theory and practice, or between discourse and practice. And I'll leave it at that, and we can expand on some of these in the conversation. The second one is that I came to this project as a Muslim feminist scholar and activist who is already committed to gender justice. And in the process, I was forced in various ways to reevaluate the ethics of assuming that a particular framework is better than another framework. So in other words, my own feminist commitments were at the very least questioned in some really interesting ways through engagement with advocates and organizations. And then the third piece is that it made me have to question what the purpose of scholarship is, what the purpose of scholarly critique in particular is. So what does it mean to study people and do more than describe them, to highlight that they exist and what they said to me and what they did? And if I wanted to level critique, what was the purpose of that critique? What might be the purpose of an academic studying people who have well existed before they became an object of study or a subject of a study like this? And so it's a occasionally, I think, painful, but always really important sort of ethical reflection on methodology and on the purpose of what we do as scholars. I trace at least some of the religious arguments that advocates have developed in the US context, in particular against domestic violence, so that they can make the argument that Islam is against domestic violence, which is the sort of, again, is the baseline of this ethic of non-abuse. There are complicated discussions of the relationship between religion and culture that we might also want to talk about a little bit more. And very obviously connected to earlier work of mine, there's a discussion there of religious authority and who gets to engage in textual interpretation. So I think I'm going to stop there and hand it over, and then we'll take it from there. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sajida Jalalzai, and I want to thank Dr. McLarney and Julie Maxwell, as well as Juliane Hammer, for this opportunity to be in conversation with someone who has been very important in my life as a scholar. I actually wanted to start off a little personally, and then we'll get into the pure objective academic scholarship questions. But I want to go back to about a decade or so, maybe, I don't exactly remember the year, 2007 or 2008, when I was a graduate student in the religion department at Columbia University. And these were the very early years of my graduate program, and I was still struggling quite a bit to find my way as a doctoral student who was interested in the study of Islam in North America, at a time when there really wasn't any clear process or institutional support to do so. What I found through my experience was that the field was, and arguably still is, quite marginalized, both by the subfields of Islamic studies and American religions. And so it was that in order to do the work that I wanted to do, I desperately needed guidance and mentorship wherever I could find it. Enter Juliane. Dr. Hammer came to give a talk at Columbia, the topic of which, unfortunately, I don't remember at all. I'm sure it was brilliant, but what I really remember from this experience was thinking, here's proof that it is possible to do this kind of important work on Islam and Muslims in North America. Not only that, her focus on questions about Muslim authority, on leadership, on gender, sexuality, and the wider context of Islamophobia really intersected perfectly with my research interests. And so, beyond that, it was a breath of fresh air to meet somebody who didn't seem to think, as so many others did, that real scholarship needs to be absolutely detached from activism, from one's position as a subject. So needless to say, I basically read everything Juliane wrote and asked her to be on my dissertation committee, to which she graciously agreed. And I continue to look to her research and her commitment to social justice as an example that I hope to emulate. So that's the personal stuff. But to get into the actual work that we're discussing today, maybe I should start off by also holding up my copy of Peaceful Families and show just how many tabs I have. This is kind of a problem that I have, over highlighting, over tagging things. But when there are that many interesting things to talk about, can't help myself. So in Peaceful Families, Dr. Hammer makes really important, significant interventions about domestic violence in America, in American society in general, and in American Muslim communities more specifically. She analyzes the way that Muslim advocates and activists engage in anti-domestic violence work, and the ways that Islam potentially functions as both a, quote, resource and a roadblock in the struggle to end domestic violence in Muslim communities. I think that this work offers valuable insights about the relationships between gender roles and marriage, sexuality, as well as questions about tradition and authority and interpretation within the Islamic context. So I've come up with a long list of questions that I want to ask, but we'll definitely not get all the way through, at least not in this specific conversation. But first, I wanted to talk about some of the themes and issues that really stood out to me personally. And the first of that, of which is Muslim authority in the United States. So, Dr. Hammer, you're really engaging in or describing the construction of a relatively new and unique form of Muslim leadership and authority in the American context that privileges very particular kinds of knowledge and specialization that are much different, generally speaking, in terms of social structure and norms in Muslim majority countries. So we're talking about an emphasis on specialization in things like counseling and psychology, pastoral care, nonprofit organization management, et cetera, et cetera. And all of these things are certainly related to the work done by probably, you know, the most recognized leadership figure in the US context, the imam of a mosque. But it's also clearly different, clearly specialized, and I think really tells us something about the development, the continued construction of Islam in the American context. And this is something you actually mentioned in your introduction, but I was deeply curious about how authority is constructed, who has the authority to make certain claims, who has the authority to use these so-called authoritative sources of Islam, like the Quran and Hadith, to make arguments about domestic violence in Islam. Of course, Juliana, you discuss conflicts and convergences and collaborations between nonprofit organizations and what might be thought of as this more traditional form of Islamic authority, i.e. imams and mosque-based leadership. But the existence of these organizations and the work of these anti-domestic violence advocates and activists, I think tells us something important about the hope that the so-called problem of domestic violence in Muslim communities can be addressed, at least in part, via these organizational structures, like the nonprofit. So I hope that we could get into that, the uniqueness of the actual institutional formations that support this kind of work. Secondly, the issues of gender and authority. Another important point of connection that I found between our projects is the complicated ways in which gender works in these professional fields. On the one hand, the growth of Muslim anti-domestic violence organizations has certainly created new spaces for Muslim women to serve as public leaders outside of the much more controversial realm of female ritual leadership, which you discuss in your previous work, More Than a Prayer. And I was particularly interested in the ways that these institutions create leadership opportunities for Muslim women in their communities that are nonetheless kept in check, so to speak, by these so-called traditional authority figures like the imam. Third, I want to hear a little bit about your discussion of Islam and anti-domestic violence work in Muslim communities in relation to what you call the mainstream domestic violence movements, as well as domestic violence organizations within other faith contexts, other faith communities. And the ways in which those kinds of collaboration, let's say between Muslim organizations and Christian or Jewish organizations, or even the secular mainstream organizations, how those collaborations do important work in the incorporation of Muslims into these conversations, into wider American society. But obviously, your analysis is quite attuned to the power dynamics that go along with that. So the tension between inclusion and the fortification of existing power dynamics. And then the last topic that I'll bring up for now that I found particularly relevant was the issue of positionality. And you've mentioned this a couple of times now. You talk about it several times in the book. And if I could just quickly read a quote, you say, "I entered these networks and circles as a Muslim insider, albeit as one who is easily identified as a Muslim feminist. As a white Muslim woman, as a convert, and as a Muslim woman who does not wear hijab, I am a very particular insider who is also a potential outsider in certain circles." And this, of course, your identity is something that you describe as, again, sort of like the way you describe Islam in this larger work of anti-domestic violence work. It is both a roadblock and a resource, right? It's both an in and something that keeps you on the outside. And coupled with the predominant culture of academia that sees, kind of personal investment or activism as somehow tainting scholarship. I would love to hear about that experience. And then, sorry, if I could just say one more thing. I have so many things. The last thing is, and this will take me into the specific questions that I have, is the point of researching these controversial issues like domestic violence within a larger anti-Muslim, Islamophobic context, right? As a Muslim and as an academic who studies Islam, I found it extremely relatable when you talked about the challenge of doing this kind of work, the difficult topics within the Muslim community that, according to some within the Muslim community should be kept, inside these circles, right? We don't want to air our dirty laundry in front of the wider public when we're already working against so many difficult stereotypes. So in your case, right, the domestic violence movements, organizations that you're looking for are, on the one hand, trying to support victims and survivors of this violence, but also trying to kind of fight against the stereotype of the violent Muslim man and the imperiled Muslim woman. So those were the main topics and themes that I found particularly relevant, both to my personal interests and my research as somebody who also studies Muslim communities in North America. So I hoped that at this point we could kind of transition into more of a conversation. And I will just begin by asking you maybe to talk about that very issue of the challenges of researching difficult topics within a context of wider anti-Muslim hostility.
Thank you. That was like a super exciting book review. And also, I mean, it is actually, this doesn't happen very often that someone who's written a book gets to talk to someone else about how they're reading it and how they're connecting with it. So I really appreciate all of these as topics. At one point, halfway through your third sort of point of interest, I was like, wow, she phrased that better than I did. And so there's sort of there's a sort of like a mirroring process that also moves my own thinking further than it goes in the book. So I mean, I'm at a point, I've written 3 monographs. I know by now that that they're never actually done, right? And so as a scholar, it makes me nervous to have this book that people read and then they think I don't talk about anything else, or I don't think about anything else, or I forgot something, or I missed something. When for me, this book is out, but it's an ongoing process, right? It's ongoing work. And so I have, in the maybe handful of talks that I've given over the past year and a half, already come to ideas that I didn't have while I was writing the book, right? So like that sort of, I just want to sort of point that out. And so I'm grateful, and I'm grateful that it is recorded. So I'm going to go back and listen, not to myself talking, I can't handle that, but to you talking about the book. So I really appreciate that. So the specter of anti-Muslim hostility is so always present that I think we sometimes forget to talk about it as part of the research that we do. There is a point in the book and in other stuff that I've written where I basically say there is no such thing as an intra-Muslim conversation. Muslims don't have conversations outside of, at the very least, an American non-Muslim gaze, and at the most something like continued and constant state surveillance, right? So that specter, I think, is always there, so much so that we sometimes forget that it's there. And I went into this work on this particular topic. I had basically expecting that people wouldn't want to talk about it for fear of airing dirty laundry. That was my expectation. And it was also interesting to me that in doing this work over a long period of time, I had done work on anti-Muslim hostility, and I had done work on Muslim activism and scholarship for gender justice. But it's in this book that those two actually come together because they are always connected with each other. And my experience as a scholar, I would say, has been especially, so my experience as a scholar has been that even in academic contexts, when I say, and you heard me emphasize it really intentionally earlier, this is a book about Muslim efforts against domestic violence, what people hear is there is domestic violence in Muslim communities, and that confirms what we already think about Muslims. It's just one version of the violent Muslim man and the oppressed Muslim woman. It's in the most sort of intimate sphere, and it goes right there with Muslims who are terrorists, right? So like it's sort of the private version of terrorism, and it's very hard to get people to hear anything else. So much so that I will say, when I'm asked to give a public talk, say at a college somewhere in the Midwest, I'm not going to give a talk about this book because it's impossible. Sometimes it's just really impossible to get past it. And when I do give talks about it, I usually start with something that now sort of sounds like a spiel. This is one of the German words that the Americans have taken from us, and I can't say it the way you say it because I'm German. But it's become something that I, at the very least, at the beginning of talks that I give name. So I go in and I say, look, we need to be able to hold at least two different arguments in tension with each other, and they're not mutually exclusive. It is possible for domestic violence to be a problem in Muslim communities and for the American government to be anti-Muslim. These are not mutually exclusive arguments to make. And so as a Muslim feminist scholar, I can criticize issues that I see in Muslim communities and at the same time work against anti-Muslim hostility. I will say that when I started approaching advocates through a sort of snowball principle, that's the bread and butter of ethnographic research, I was really surprised that the people who have worked in the Muslim anti-DV field have relatively little concern about this dirty laundry issue. It was never brought up to me as a reason not to talk about it. What did happen was that people wanted to know why I was doing this work. So I regularly got this question of, why are you interested in this? And part of that question comes out of a sort of particular dynamic in the DV movement, where many of the people who do work there are survivors of domestic abuse. And so part of the question was a question about whether that's my reason too, which it isn't. But I had to come up with a good answer, which also sort of connects with this question of purpose, right? So like, it's not an exposure project. It's not a project to say, look, this is how bad it is. So I think for me, it's really just something that needs to continuously, and in all the other questions, be part of the conversation. So for example, you were asking, and I don't know if we're going to come back to it, but you were asking about Muslims working with and in connection with the mainstream and with other religious anti-DV organizations. And anti-Muslim hostility is big there, right? Both in the form of, well, I mean, it is alongside racism. In the secular movement, anti-religiousness is sort of a current that's certainly there, that's linked to a particular history of secular feminism in the United States. But even within religious contexts, there is an unequal power dynamic, and those exclusions of Muslims as too different to cooperate with in the same ways that Jews and Christians might, or Christians of different denominations, is certainly a somewhat more liberal form of anti-Muslim hostility that's not looking at as crass, but that's also much harder to trace and to respond to. So I think that that for me, talking about anti-Muslim hostility has become something that needs to happen every step of the way. In the book, it happens primarily in the first chapter, and then sort of comes up in echoes a couple of more times, but I think that it's actually something that has to be built into everything. And one of the ways in which I think that happens is that Muslims are keenly aware that their conversations are not internal. And I would argue that their conversations or debates about issues like domestic violence are at least in part shaped by that hostile gaze.
I think that's an important point to make. The fact that Muslims are aware of the gaze, and that is something that I also experienced in my field work. Around the time before I did my field work, when I was reading anthropological work about Muslim communities in North America, there were often discussions about the difficulties or challenges of doing ethnographic work in this culture of surveillance, right? And the need for the anthropologist or the ethnographer to sort of overcome suspicion, et cetera, et cetera. And when I myself was in the field, I found absolutely no hesitation, really, when I requested to do this work within Muslim/interfaith communities. And in fact, some of my respondents really welcomed the opportunity to have someone basically take their story and disseminate it so that, they could prove to the rest of the world that they were good Muslims, right? So Muslims are in ways hyper aware of the external gaze, which I think you're right, absolutely limits internal debate. And I'm not sure if that's completely unique to the US context or not. But if I could move to another question, I hope that you could speak a little bit about this really intriguing concept of protective patriarchy, specifically vis-a-vis the positionality that you present of yourself as a Muslim feminist, as a feminist in general. you connect this work to your previous book, and basically say that unlike the woman-led prayer movement, domestic violence isn't necessarily a feminist issue, right? And I think that that directly connects to this idea of protective patriarchy. So if you could take us through that.
Yeah. So yes. So the woman-led prayer topic was sort of clearly in the direction of my own interests. I didn't necessarily immediately have sort of a very strong position on whether women should lead prayers or not, but at least sort of the direction of that was in line with my own commitments. And I will also I will say that domestic violence as an issue in the broader American society and in broader American history has been a feminist issue, right? So domestic violence as the core piece initially of violence against women goes back to activist work in the feminist movement in the 1960s. And it is thanks to feminist advocacy that we now have laws that criminalize certain aspects of domestic abuse at the very least. Now, there's lots more to say about whether that actually works, whether criminalizing domestic abuse decreases anything. The Violence Against Women Act from 1991 also provided funding for services for survivors in particular, has always provided relatively little funding for work with perpetrators. But it is, in the context of the United States, a deeply feminist issue. And so I went into this project basically having embraced this idea, right? That the reason why domestic abuse happens is because of power imbalances in the family, in marriage in particular. And so, you know, like the way to end it is to make marriage different, or God forbid, get rid of marriage altogether, right? So like this is I can only be snarky about it at this point, but and I started talking to people, I started attending these events, and that was absolutely not what was happening there in terms of the framework. And I would at this point say, and I say similar things in the book, so some of the advocates, I don't want to put a number on it, but some of the advocates had similar sort of feminist commitments to mine. And then there were many, many more. And just for the record, most of the advocacy work is done by women. So many, many more didn't seem to have any sort of feminist leanings. And I was also not seeing feminist Quran interpretation, for example, prominently show up in these arguments. And I think what I had to sort of come to was that this was challenging my framework really deeply. And my students think that I use the word patriarchy as a bad word. That's not quite true, but I'm certainly critical of it as a hierarchical structure that, in my view at least, is in opposition to sort of egalitarian and more just societal structures. And this notion of protective or benevolent patriarchy, I use it in the book to explain how Muslim advocates make sense of the difference between abuse and non-abuse. So there is a clear line for them. I've never met anyone in this work who was sort of saying things like, well, it depends on how hard they get hit, or, you know, like how badly they suffer. That's not something that happens. The stance against abuse, and not only physical abuse, so like psychological abuse, spiritual abuse, economic abuse, immigration status abuse, all of that is included in this framework. And so then I was sort of like, so, but then what's causing it, right? Like, what do you think is causing it? And protective patriarchy is a way to explain that what many of the advocates think is causing it is a disintegration of the function that patriarchy is supposed to have, which is to protect women and children. It's based on a framework that I still don't embrace, that men and women are essentially different and that women are weaker. But what it helps them do is say, if a man abuses his wife, he is actually forsaking his responsibility for her. And that's why abuse is wrong. And so it's a framework that's definitely not feminist in nature, but one that is very effective. And I would say that some people in the movement use this as a framework because it's more effective with the Muslim communities that they work with. So walking in there and saying, feminist analysis shows us that hierarchy in the family produces domestic violence, and we can only stop it if we stop the hierarchy in the family, isn't going to work. So in some cases, it's a strategic embracing of protective patriarchy. But I would also say that for many of the people I talk to, many of the women I talk to, it is really how they see the world and what the problem is. And that was a real challenge for me. And so I would still say that, at least in the context of Muslim communities, domestic violence is not a feminist issue. It's an issue that you can work on if you have never touched anything feminist with a 10-foot pole. That's not a contradiction. And I think it goes to show how important it is to not take our own ethical or normative frameworks for granted. I'm not saying we shouldn't have them, but for me, it was actually really important to rethink why I have these commitments and what I mean by them. And I quote Keisha Ali in the book and have often thought about this. She says at the end of Sexual Ethics in Islam, in the conclusion, that what we at the time still called progressive Muslims are actually have a need to explain their positions instead of just assuming that they're morally superior because they're obviously morally superior. And I think that is also, it holds in it at least the possibility of conversations with people we disagree with, which was also really important for me, right? The domestic violence is not going to end if Muslim feminists get together and talk about it more. Not even when they provide services or raise awareness. It's going to end when we get more of Muslim communities to agree that it's bad and it needs to end. And like very broadly speaking, I think it's also a question of something that all activists or all people work for change face, which is sort of the tension between their ultimate vision for society and the steps that they might have to take to get there. So there is a strategic part to activist work that needs to be adjusted to the circumstances that it's taking place in. If you have a lofty goal and people don't want to go there with you, then you can't sort of do anything. And I think in the US context in nonprofit work, I'm glad you brought that up earlier. There's a tension there about whether nonprofits are there as part of civil society to fix the failings of the state, which is how they often function in the US context. And if that is the case, whether their exclusive focus on a particular issue is also preventing them from seeing that particular issue as part of a systemic problem, right? So if you work against domestic violence, do you by extension also work on sexual violence? Do you also work on abolition, for example, right? Like, are these somehow connected with each other?
And of course, I'm thinking about one of the things you said earlier, which is, you know, this kind of work requires you to think about the politics of critique and the purpose of critique. Mm-hmm. Is there anything you want to add about that?
So now when I look at those passages in the book, in some places I'm cringing at my own sort of cringiness about certain things. So like I'll give you a particular example. One of the places where I come out very strongly in a particular direction that is critical of how the work is being done is the attempts and efforts to create Muslim-only shelters for women, for abuse victims. And I did some work in shelters and had conversations with quite a few people who sort of work around them. And one of the reasons why I come out in that way is because I saw things that I considered serious issues. One of them is the real difficulty to maintain them. And so creating a shelter and then continuously raising enough money to maintain it are two different steps. And so I think it can be super counterproductive to create a shelter and then not have the funds and have to close it, right? Like it re-victimizes the people in the shelter at the very least. I also saw quite a bit of pressure to be particular kinds of Muslim women in a shelter. And so there was one at least where the women were expected to wear hijab even if they didn't before they came to the shelter. And there was a very strong sort of encouragement to pray. And so I really have concerns about what that does to people who already part of abuse is losing autonomy. And so being in a setting where this many things are already predefined seems to me to be an issue. And there are other ways that I saw and other strategies to provide shelter that wasn't in a house full of abuse victims. And so I come out pretty strongly, but I'm also really nervous about that because of course these Muslim women shelters where they do exist also do serve people. And sort of as someone who's never worked in a shelter and who's not going to open a shelter, I'm also in a complicated position, I think, ethically and morally to say this isn't how Muslims should do it. And then doing it publicly, which takes us back to the anti-Muslim hostility piece, right? And I have come to a place that I hope doesn't sound like a cop-out, but this idea that I'm offering these relatively strong positions. The other one is my discussion of whether I think honor killings is a useful term, as basically openings for a conversation, including the possibility that if I talk to someone long enough, they might convince me otherwise. But in order to have that conversation, I had to sort of take a position. I worked, I think, very hard to make sure that I didn't deconstruct the work that the advocates were doing, because that's not what I see as my purpose as a scholar. And I'll admit there were moments certainly during the sort of the period when I was writing being the most lonely part of academic work when you're also an ethnographer, where I really wondered what the purpose of it might be. Right, like whether there is a point to it. And then one thing that I didn't want to happen, and I'm pretty sure that didn't happen, is I didn't want the book to be, or the project to be a sort of a stepping stone for me to develop great theory, which is something in religious studies more generally, in Islamic studies maybe less so, sort of this expectation of creating theory. In that particular case, it struck me as somewhat obscene to write about the suffering and abuse of people in order to look smart. And some people probably look at this book and are like, it's too accessible. It's not theoretical enough. At least one of the critiques I got was that it wasn't theoretical enough, that I don't do enough with affect theory. And I will say that I could have, but it was intentional on my part because I felt very uncomfortable with that idea that the book would sort of, like enter the market, so to speak, as an intervention in affect theory. I don't want that. I really didn't want that.
So if I could just ask one more question before turning it over to audience questions. I have to bring up the topic of culture versus religion. This is one of the most important themes that I saw running throughout the book. And it's quite hard for me to narrow down a particular question. So my cop-out is going to be to ask you to speak about efforts to separate religion from culture sort of throughout your experience in the field.
So you're right, it does run through the book. It was also something that I was interested in before I started working on this project, because it's not religion, it's culture comes up with alarming frequency, both in Muslim community conversations, but also, interestingly, in Muslim feminist scholarly discourse, right? So in both of those, it keeps showing up. And typically it does as Islam is good and culture is bad. And so at the very least, I think what I try to do is trace how the distinction between religion and culture is deployed in different settings in dramatically different ways. And I think deployed sounds to me as a non-native speaker like it's maybe not a good word, but it is strategic. It's a strategic way to work with it. And I think one way to sort of connect it back to the sort of theme of Islam as a resource and as a roadblock is that that's modeled on the idea that everything in the situation of a domestic violence survivor can be a resource or a roadblock. But that already points to the fact that it's a question of deployment, of application. So to give you an example that has nothing to do with religion, nothing with culture, DV advocates talk about family as potentially a roadblock. If you, as a survivor, don't have support from your family, definitely a roadblock to it being acknowledged and addressed. What they often encourage survivors to do is to identify individual family members who can be a resource. So rather than thinking of the entire family as a roadblock, it's important to distinguish and to make use of resources because it's necessary to have them. And so I think of Islam and culture in similar ways. And that's different. And that was an important thing for me. So like in this particular context, culture sometimes is a resource. It's not always a roadblock. It is also often used as what's to blame so that Islam is not to blame, right? So like the dynamic depends. As I said, the sort of basic maxim that Islam is against domestic violence. It's not only what Islam says about domestic violence, it's that Islam is against domestic violence. And I think Islam here is a stand-in for God in very specific ways discursively. Then sort of raises the question, but then what is responsible? And culture is a relatively easy go-to. It also shows up in things like advocates talking about how Muslims from different cultures, and I don't want to put sort of quotation marks around it or sort of air quotes around it, but how Muslims from different cultures experience and do domestic violence differently. So it's not only the binary between religion, which is good, and against domestic violence and culture, but also that different cultures are differently implicated as a source of domestic violence. And here it's very easy to also fall into essentially anti-Muslim stereotypes, right? Like fall into a framework where South Asian culture is uniquely inclined towards particular types of domestic violence. An example, every advocate brings up at some point that in-law abuse is much more common in South Asian culture, right? So as a specific feature. Or someone will say, well, African-American Muslim women don't take shit from their husbands. And so domestic violence doesn't happen in the same way there, which is a not very sort of like veiled form of anti-Black racism in some ways, because it also means less access to resources, for example, right? And so it's very, very contextual and deployable in these different ways. And so I was interested in precisely this: is there a singular answer to what's the relationship between religion and culture? And my answer would be no. And I think if we looked harder in other contexts where that gets deployed, for example, in matrimonial practices, or in why mosques are still primarily ethnically and racially organized, we'll find that there too, I think there is much more nuance to it than this sort of singular, they're both sort of blobs. And I will say, this is sort of another place where this ethical consideration of what happens when I, as a scholar, call these constructions. Do I, by calling them constructions, by describing them as constructions, do I already undermine the claims that advocates are making to them, right? So I, as a scholar, will say that Islam doesn't speak, that Islam doesn't say anything. The Quran on its own doesn't say anything. There are a vast number of interpretations of the Quran, including of verse 434, which comes up in all of the conversations inevitably at some point. But it doesn't actually help the advocates if I, as a scholar, say, well, here's this real breadth of interpretations of 434, because what they need is an authoritative interpretation of 434 that helps them argue against domestic abuse. And if there are lots of possibilities, that authority is automatically lessened, right? And so again, here, I think sort of talking about construction, which is one of our favorite postmodern words, is in itself already a step in the direction of, am I critiquing it? Am I undermining it? Is it ethical to undermine it by calling it a construction? And so I tried to sort of be very careful about, so I think about it in the way I think about race as a social construct, right? So that race as a social construct doesn't mean that it's not incredibly powerful and shaping people's lives. And telling an African-American person that race is a social construct doesn't do anything to the racism that they experience. And so it's sort of along similar lines that nuance can sometimes get in the way of political intervention, but I think it can also be helpful to responsibly engage in political intervention. I used the P word for politics.
Great. Well, I guess in the interest of time, we should open it up to the audience. I know that there are some questions that have already been asked in the chat box. Maybe, sorry?
Oh my, there's some stuff going on.
There's a lot going on. Well, let me just start off here, and then I can ask if anyone wants to actually ask their question live. What, if anything, do you think would be some insights that Muslim feminists can take away from this project and apply in their own work? And I guess let me just add my own, I'm gonna cheat and tag on a little bit more here, but who do you hope reads this book? And what do you hope that it can offer to different audiences?
So who do I hope reads this book? Everyone. Of course, that's not going to happen. I think that it can be read by different audiences in different ways and for very different purposes. So I would say that as work that reflects on scholarship and activism, and on a topic that I assure you no one ever wants to talk about. One thing that I think I haven't said yet is that I experienced working on this project as perpetually being challenged, mainly because no one really wants to think about domestic abuse. My sort of own explanation is that that's because it's so rampant that it would force people to consider often their own experiences. If it is true that 1 in 4 women in US society experiences physical abuse by a partner, by an intimate partner in her lifetime, then many more people around us have or do experience various forms of domestic abuse, and many more people around us are perpetrators as well. And so I think sort of the reaction that I often see is just discomfort, and discomfort produces re-silencing. And I experienced that on all levels. It was not easy to find a publisher for this book. The response that I most often got was, it's too specialized. So like the topic isn't broad enough. If I'd written a book on marriage, I could have published it with like at least 5 different Muslims and marriage in the United States. So too specialized was one. It was very difficult to get funding for it. I'd like to think that that's not just because I'm bad at grant writing, but also I did get funding for other projects. Again, a project on sex and marriage in American Muslim communities was not a problem. And so it's sort of on all levels, right? I spoke at the Association of Muslim Chaplains conference earlier in the spring, and there were far fewer people than in all the other panels that were happening. And I think that tells us something, right? So, I mean, at this point, like when the book came out, I was worried that academics would think it's not academic enough and no one else would be interested in reading it. And that one of the reactions from the sort of elusive and imagined Muslim communities would be to just not want to talk about it. So like to sort of add to the silence that's already there. That's not quite been my experience. It's more complicated than that. I know that not only advocates that I actually interviewed and worked with, but also quite a few other ones have read the book and want to talk to me about it and tell me that it's helping them reflect on the dynamics of their work, that because DV is an acute issue, they never have time to think about. And so I'm also working with an organization that doesn't work on domestic violence, but on sexual violence, Heart Women and Girls, that and I'm seeing in the work with that organization how important it can be to think about things like, where do we strategically position ourselves so that we talk to the most Muslims about what the issue is that we're trying to address. And having a book that says, here's how people do that, and here's how you can sort of reflect on how you want to do that. I got an email from a community in Hong Kong last week who want to do a workshop and compare what this is like in the US and what it's like there. I have heard from people pretty much all over the world, activists. One was a dear friend of mine who said she insisted on buying the book for the nonprofit that she is working with, and she's making everyone read it. So it's happening, but it's also like all this work, because it feels so acute, it's just really slow. It feels really slow. And of course, the pandemic hasn't helped, even though, just sort of for the record, the pandemic has definitely increased incidents of domestic violence. One of the things that happens when people are in crisis and when they're isolated is an increase in domestic abuse. If that happens over Thanksgiving break, it definitely happened over the pandemic, together with a reduction in services and a reduction in possibilities of getting away. So that part is something I think we're not going to see the magnitude of until we arrive at some type of new normal. So I think, yeah, I mean, I think reception is slow, and I don't want to make it an ego thing. I'm really just hoping that it inspires people, you know, like to put little tabs everywhere and talk with each other about it if they're not talking with me about it. Inshallah.
Inshallah. Would anyone like to ask their question live? A question.
Live questions.
If not, there are others. There have been a couple of questions. Oh, Zainab? Yes, please.
Yes, assalamu alaikum. Thanks
Salam.
for, whoops, how do I take away this? Okay, there we go. So my question is, in regards to your work, how effective, in your perspective, are Muslim anti-domestic violence efforts to educate and advocate for victims within a traditionalist or a conservative Islamic framework? Essentially what you were referring to in passing as using the paradigm of protective patriarchy. So from your observations, how effective do you think those efforts have been? And secondary to that as well, did you see any examples of where culture was actually a positive factor that was used in Muslim anti-domestic violence work at all?
So those are two big questions. The first one, so I would say, and I say that in the book too, that while I can't measure more or less effective, I think it was clear to me as I was doing my field work that the framework of protective patriarchy as a guiding framework is effective because it meets where more of Muslim communities are in terms of their own perspectives. I want to sort of be measured about it though, because one of the things that became more clear to me after the book came out is that I am perhaps also guilty of thinking of Muslim communities as connected to mosques. And it is in fact the case that vast majorities of Muslims are not connected to mosques, but most DV efforts are connected or are sort of aimed at mosque communities, which sort of creates another layer of silence and of invisibility for Muslims that don't go to a mosque but also experience domestic violence. So it is the case that meeting people and meeting communities where they are at is the most effective strategy that we have. Of course, part of the challenge of doing domestic violence work is that it's not ending and that the rates aren't even decreasing as far as we can tell. And so to keep going and to think about strategies as effective and less effective, and to think about deeper root causes and things like that, I think often need to go together, but that's not necessarily always happening. So if you're asking quantitatively, I would say it's a very small component of anti-DV work, especially both awareness work and services that are provided by people who identify explicitly as feminists. It's definitely not something that I've seen in organizations and how they self-identify. And tell me what the other question was again, Zainab.
Sorry,
Oh,
yeah.
culture. Yes.
The second question, yeah.
Yes.
So examples of
I want to refer you all to in a relatively short paper that Professor Zarina Grewal wrote after the Asia Zubair murder. That's called Death by Culture. That I engage with in the book in a particular place where she basically says it doesn't help us to say Islam is not the problem, but culture is the problem, precisely because it perpetuates anti-Muslim hostility and just recasts Muslimness as a cultural phenomenon, which already happens sometimes, right? Like some of the sort of secularizing tendencies are to racialize Muslims and to use culture as a stand-in for religion because religion cannot be named. And so death by culture, which is how the sort of media coverage around Asia Zubair, at least in part, sort of played out, and Muslims participated in it, according to Grewal, is not it is not a good way to go about this. And so she ends with something along similar lines of culture can be a resource. And it's important in order to be effective, to use that term again, Zainab, that you introduced, it's important in order to be effective to draw on it as a resource, because we're losing something if we're not doing that. And it shows up in things like the focus on the family and the community over the individual. You can make sometimes at least a maslaha argument against domestic violence, right? Like an argument that it is against communal interest to allow abuse to continue. You can see it in discussions of the impact on children when domestic abuse occurs, right? Like sort of a trauma framework that is supposed to end a sort of chain reaction of abuse. So it absolutely shows up in positive ways as well. And then it is often not in juxtaposition to Islam. That doesn't make Islam the problem. It just then gets detached from Islam and is sort of culture on its own, and culture in the plural sometimes.
I believe Peter had a question.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks. Thanks so much for setting this up and having this conversation. I had a question about something that you kind of alluded to as far as your own personal journey of having your framework challenged in some of the ways that you had thought about these issues. That kind of resonated with me, especially thinking about scholarship and a lot of Muslim feminist scholarship on Islamic law and involved in questions about representing the past in terms of the sort of content of Islamic law. For example, Keisha Ali's work on sexual ethics in Islam. It does seem like a little bit maybe at cross purposes with some of the imperatives of somebody trying to argue for an authoritative, sort of protective, patriarchal interpretation. And I'm wondering if you've had conversations with scholars who are doing this kind of work, not necessarily in the DV space, but in academia, writing about historical texts and things like that, and if they've had any thoughts about or takeaways from this work on their own work.
So I think, I mean, that's a it would be a much more sort of subtle type of conversation in some ways. I don't want to say that people haven't talked about domestic violence specifically. So one of the very sort of powerful interventions in that debate in both discursive and very practical way is Amna Wadood's book Inside the Gender Jihad, where she at some point declares that she is saying no to 434. So like doing more than Khalid Abu Fadl's conscientious pause to actually say there is no circumstance under which any kind of physical disciplining is conceivable for me. I sort of drew inspiration from Mohtakaf, who in a non-academic publication talks about how domestic violence in her Muslim community, in her particular Muslim community, challenged her faith and sort of made her come around to a position to say, we need to be leaders in order to change these things. This isn't about Islam. This is about how we do Islam, and that can be changed. And I mean, I think Muslim feminist scholars sort of run a pretty wide spectrum. I often think of Keisha Ali's and my work as sort of co-constitutive. She does the textual discursive stuff, and I research what Muslims actually do and how they sort of put that into practice or don't put it into practice. I will say towards the end of my fieldwork, I was really surprised that once in a while, you know, like in a PowerPoint by one Muslim advocacy organization, Quran and Women and Sexual Ethics in Islam would suddenly show up. And so I think part of maybe what you're asking, I don't know if that's what you're asking, I don't want to infer things, but part of what it sort of raises as a question for me is the relationship between scholars and people who identify primarily as activists.
Mhm.
Right? So where is expertise located and where is authority located? One of the reasons why advocates often don't draw on Muslim feminist scholarship is because they're not drawing on scholarship, period. They're actually developing their own interpretations. And then sometimes they will look for validation from mostly male scholars, or I want to be careful with that. Ingrid Mattson clearly is not a male scholar, but she would fall into the purview of scholars that can be called upon for authority, right? So like, I also want to sort of make sure that we don't end up with all men are patriarchs and all women are feminists. That's really just not how the communities or even the academic conversations work. So I'm expecting that it will, in the long term, there will sort of be a, here are these ideas and these textual engagements. Some of the Muslim feminist textual engagements reject the interpretive tradition and some of them engage with it. So I think that's also an interesting spectrum to consider. And I am actually in my own work moving towards thinking very, very differently about who produces knowledge, who produces Islamic knowledge, and that this idea that scholars produce knowledge hasn't actually served as well for understanding how ideas operate and are navigated in our communities. I think I'm sort of I want to move away from scholars produce knowledge and activists apply it, because that's definitely not how this happens in the context that I studied. I feel like I didn't answer your question, Peter.
No, that was great. Thank you.
Does anyone else want to ask a live question? If not, then in the chat, someone asked about sources of funding, and that's something I think we didn't really address and is important. So do we know about the sources of funding in these organizations?
I mean, we do, and it's very depressing. So it might seem rather sort of Marxist to talk about the money, but none of this is possible without it, right? So and funding is a perpetual issue. If I can't get funding to do a research project on domestic violence, imagine what it takes to raise funds to actually provide services and programming. So communities that are already reluctant to talk about an issue will not donate for that issue to be taken up. And so funding is a perpetual challenge. Some of the organizations that I studied simply disintegrated because they ran out of funding. It's also really important to understand that nonprofit funding in the US, funding for maintaining nonprofits takes up a very big portion of the work that nonprofits do, which is stupid, right? So like to think that you spend 50% of your time and your efforts on grant writing that you're supposed to spend on actually doing work on whatever the issue is that you want to work on. There is a very complicated way in which sometimes Muslim organizations can and will get state funding. Very, very, very hard to get federal funding. The Department of Justice in particular is not inclined towards funding religious organizations, but especially not Muslim ones. So there's sort of like weird litmus tests where you can't talk about Islam as a roadblock or a resource. You can, however, talk about culture, including Muslim culture, all you want. As long as you don't talk about religion, you can get funding. State level funding, every state in the US has a state coalition against domestic violence that gets state funds. Sometimes organizations will be successful. However, with state funding, one, there are often strings attached. One that is most common is that organizations that take state funding have to provide services to anyone. They can't be exclusive to Muslims. And the second thing is that, of course, applying as a Muslim organization for funding to work against domestic violence also re-enters the cycle of confirming that there is domestic violence in Muslim communities and it is somehow exceptional and special. So yeah, I mean, I don't think I can put it in any starker terms. There's never enough money, and there are not enough services. And services for survivors often need to be reliable over a longer period of time, because again, if you're forced to go back to an abuser because your shelter ran out of funding, that's all kinds of issues that raises, right? So in really practical terms, money, it really is everything. And the other part of it is that at least some of these organizations rely, because of lack of funding, on volunteers. And volunteers are both, it's an exploitative relationship. Volunteering for a domestic violence organization can be an actual safety risk. Sometimes abusers will sort of direct their rage not towards their own victims, but people who help their victims. So that aspect is certainly there. Burnout is a huge issue, right? Because if you work on an issue like that, you also need resources for collective self-care or for individualized self-care to prevent burnout. And all of that takes money. And then one of the discussions that's sort of tangential in the book, it shows up there somewhere, is also a discussion about professionalizing. So for nonprofit workers to be trained in what they're doing rather than having sort of acquired it through volunteering and what that does. So that's a perpetual sort of conversation among Muslim advocates as well. And then I'll link it to that because I think that's important. One of the most depressing things that I saw and that I decided not to write about in the book extensively is that because resources are so scarce, these organizations also effectively compete with each other. And that expresses itself in things like one organization developing, say, a resource to raise awareness, and then ferociously guarding this resource from being shared with others, even though the purpose of awareness is to share it with as many people as possible, right? And so if you develop a resource and you don't get credit for it, then you can't use it to apply for more funding. And so it really is a terrible sort of dynamic of competition. And so, yeah, ultimately, most of it is about the money. That could have been a separate book in some way, sort of like a different lens on these dynamics. Definitely a really important issue.
I think that brings us to the end of our time. So let me personally thank all of you for attending. Thank you, Juliana, for sharing all of these valuable insights with us and for writing this book. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to be in conversation with you about it.